Radix Big Tent is the think tank of system change. We're interested in complex systems and the catalytic steps that you can take to bring about reform. And one of our big projects over the last year or so has been around what we call resilient democracy. And first and foremost, oh, feedback. So somebody's just joined and not muted. If I could just mute. One of our key objectives was really to make certain that the government delivered on the commitments it had made in the manifesto, and those ones that we've begun to focus on more and more around political finance. Delighted that earlier this week the government did announce that they would be upholding or restoring the independence of the Electoral Commission. That's a major step and it's really important. But I feel there's still some way to go around their commitments on political finance in the Representation of the People Bill, and that's what we'll be picking up today. To lead us in that discussion, we have Rachel Sylvester, who you will all know, and is joining us to chair the discussion from the Observer, and I'll let her introduce the speakers. Just to say, we like these discussions to be interactive. Please use the comments section for comments. That allows you to have a debate with the others on the call. Please feel free to submit questions that way. Rachel will pull in ones and make certain that they're put to our guests or invite you to speak. And with that, thank you, Rachel, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Ben. As Ben said, I'm Rachel Sylvester. I'm the political editor of The Observer. And it's great to be here. This is such an important topic. I think, if anything, the most important defining theme in politics is the anti-politics mood and the concerns about the sort of future of democracy. And the Epstein scandal has obviously just highlighted that, this sense of a disconnect between a kind of elite floating above the rest of us and the general population. So I think the bill that the government has brought forward is very important, but there are lots of questions about whether it goes far enough. So what it does, I'm sure everyone knows, but obviously introduces votes at 16. There are some additional controls on foreign donations, but lots of people say those don't go far enough. There's some more controls on sort of intimidation of candidates and punishment of that. But big gaps over, for example, cryptocurrency donations and also things like deepfake images, which have been, we're seeing more and more of within politics, distorting the political debate. So we've got such a fascinating and brilliant panel with us today to talk through all these things. Kamila Kingstone, who is Defending Democracy campaign lead from Spotlight on Corruption. Duncan Hames, who's a policy director from Transparency International UK. Eliza Lockhart, who's a research fellow at the Centre for Finance and Security at the Royal United Services Institute. And joining us soon, she's in the chamber, couldn't get out immediately, is Rachel Blake, the Labour MP for the Cities of London and Westminster, and also a member of the Anti-Corruption All-Party Parliamentary Group. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to set out their initial thoughts before we get into a debate. Really, what's right about the bill and what's missing? Kamila, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, very happy to. Thank you so much. And thank you very much to Radix for inviting me. I think we would all agree that there are serious problems with political funding in our politics. I think the public knows it, even if they don't know all the details. So the Electoral Commission has found that just 14% of the public trust politicians. YouGov found that just 4% of the public think that politicians do what is best for their country. And the Home Office found that 80% of the public is worried about corruption among politicians. So I think the public knows there's a problem, even if they don't know the details. I think there are two problems with money in our politics. One is big money and the other is foreign money. And they're not mutually exclusive. So most foreign money is big money, but not all big money is foreign money. But in terms of big money, lots of people are genuinely surprised to learn that there is no cap on the amount of money that you can donate to a political party. I won't go into this in more detail because I'm sure Duncan will talk about this later. But we can see the result of that. So we know that there was a £9 million donation last year from Christopher Harborne, who's a British businessman based in Thailand, to Reform UK. The data released from the Electoral Commission this morning says that he made another £3 million donation. But it's not just on the right. Labour received a £4 million donation from Quadrature Capital in 2024. And there is no way that somebody donates this amount of money without wanting or getting something in return. So there is a serious problem with big money. At the same time, there's also a problem with foreign money. So although it is true that only UK electors or UK registered companies or unincorporated associations can donate to a political party, it still leaves ways for foreign money to get into our system. So we know that Elon Musk threatened/offered to donate 100 million to Reform UK. He couldn't do it directly, but he could do it through one of his UK registered companies. And we also know that a Swiss-German billionaire with alleged connections to Germany's far right has donated 250,000 to the Carlton Club, which itself is a regular donor to the Conservatives. So there are still ways for foreign money to get into politics in the UK. The Representation of the People Bill does do some positive things, as Rachel said. So it bans shell companies from donating, which is really helpful as a way so that a foreign donor can't just set up a company, funnel money through it, and then shut it down again. It increases transparency around unincorporated associations, which are very informal organizations that don't need to be registered, where there was a lot of opacity around them previously. And parties will have to do extra risk assessments on political donations over £11,000. So the bill does do some good things, but there is a long way to go. So one of the things it needs to do is introduce a donation cap. It needs to reduce the spending limits in elections that the government increased by 80% between 2019 and 2024. So it needs to lower them. It needs to make them annual, so they don't just apply in the few months before an election, but apply all year round, all the time. Really crucially, the government needs to strengthen enforcement, both civil enforcement of political finance rules and criminal enforcement, because we know that nobody has ever been sent to prison for an electoral finance offence, and that cannot be because no one has ever committed an electoral finance offence. We also need to tighten the rules around corporate donations so that only profit-making companies can donate and only from their profits. So you can't get loss-making companies making huge donations to political parties because, again, money is being funneled through them. We need to strengthen the risk assessment further, and we think we should ban crypto donations to prevent dodgy money getting into politics. But I know Eliza will talk more about that later on. So these are just some of the things we could do in the bill. There are so many ways for the government to improve this bill, and this is a once in a parliament opportunity to do it. So we mustn't let it go to waste. Thank you.
Thank you. Duncan, do you want to pick up on some of those themes? Transparency International obviously favours transparency, but is that enough, or do we actually need limits as well?
Thank you, Rachel. Absolutely, transparency is not enough. And yes, you hear that from the horse's mouth, if you like. I'm very much in agreement with what you've heard from Kamila, but let me build on this. This is not a complicated problem. The politicians make it complicated because they're unwilling to engage with fairly straightforward solutions.
So I think we're struggling with your Wi-Fi. Sorry, with your Wi-Fi, or at least I am.
Duncan, you've frozen, I think.
To practice of political finance with which to sustain their political careers. So it's very hard for them to make objective decisions, and indeed will feel a high degree of pressure from those involved and responsible for fundraising in their political parties for how they engage with these questions in Parliament. So that is what makes this difficult. Not that it's complicated, but that the decision makers are conflicted. Fortunately, as this bill has progressed, it has flushed out a lot of support. yesterday, certainly not on Monday, rather, certainly we heard a number of Green and Liberal Democrat MPs, but also Labour MPs calling for a cap on donations. Dame Annalise Dodds last month in Parliament said that she believed the time has come for a cap on donations. Phil Brickell, chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Anti-Corruption, has made it clear that that's something that he wants to see too. And we have drafted proposed amendments that would enable that to be introduced into this bill. People have been calling for a cap on donations for a very long time. I'd hate to say that any of you will remember Hayden Phillips's review, but nonetheless, 20 years ago, Hayden Phillips was probably the closest we got to brokering a solution on this in a particular political climate. A similar time, Baroness Helena Kennedy was calling for a £10,000 cap on donations, as was the Committee on Standards in Public Life as well. A strong case has been made to us that the political parties will need a bit of space to adapt, to change their practices, to come off their current dependency on their current fundraising model. And so the amendment that we are hoping will be tabled by the MPs supporting a cap invites a transition to take place by 2030. So annual caps, which by 2030 would be at a level of £50,000 annually, so as to address what I think is the fundamental concern that is blocking getting progress on this, which is the practical concerns of political parties. But you said at the beginning, Rachel, that the underlying issue here is one of anti-politics. And it's YouGov, not any of the campaign groups that you've got represented here, that has been polling annually voters' views on this issue, which are getting steadily more forthright. End of last year, 2/3 of those polled by YouGov in a very large sample, I think it was 13,000, said that they wanted a cap on private donations in British politics of no more than £50,000 per annum. And indeed, many of them, like Dennis, I think in his contributions in the chat, would rather they didn't exist at all. But 2/3, right? So it's twice as many as all of the other people holding other views on this question think that the cap should be no more than £50,000 per year. So the politicians are very out of line with the public in maintaining the status quo of there not being a cap at all. And so we've tried to chart a path whereby they could close that gap before this anti-politics sentiment that you quite rightly put your finger on, Rachel, gets any worse. I think with a former Welsh party leader currently serving a 10-year prison sentence for taking bribes, and the news just yesterday about suspicions of those close to politicians acting on behalf of foreign espionage operations. And as Kamila pointed out, the news today that a further £3 million has come from the same person that has already given £9 million last year. The status quo is totally unsustainable, and we're urging MPs to seize this opportunity to change it.
Thank you very much. Eliza, I wondered whether you could pick up on some of the questions about whether this bill is already out of date, because I think there's a real issue about cryptocurrency, whether and also about deepfakes. That is the bill kind of become out of date before it's even come into law? Does it need to are there loopholes in terms of new technologies that need to be closed?
I think Unfortunately, when you are dealing with any kind of democratic safeguards, you are always playing catch up in this situation. So I don't think that should deter us from trying to do the best we can. It's always going to be a matter of trying to keep pace with the resources and the skills of our adversaries. And for anyone who doesn't know, my organization, RUSI, it's a defense and security think tank. So I come to this topic from a national security perspective. And I think something that I'm originally Australian. I used to work for the chairperson of the Australian Electoral Commission dealing with this. And I think something that continually surprises me is the lack of appreciation in this country as to the level of attack that our democratic processes are under from foreign adversaries. The UK is a clear target for foreign interference operations. We only have to see, as Duncan mentioned, the recent arrests to show that there are hostile state actors with a high level of interest in interfering with our democratic processes. And I think that is something that we continually don't see, in my mind, enough response to. And obviously we don't want to alarm, we don't want to create panic, but we need to be prepared. So whilst this bill does contain very relevant and important controls on certain channels for foreign money, it is not as good as it could be. And given that this bill is purported to be designed to future-proof our political finance regime for as long as we can do that, there are some clear gaps that should be implemented. The one I think I'll talk about, because I don't want to take up the floor for forever. I think all of us could talk about this still for a long time, is the cryptocurrency point. So we at RUSI do deployments. The Centre for Finance and Security has worked with the governments of Romania and Moldova and Armenia looking at Russian-backed foreign interference operations and how they work. And cryptocurrencies are a clear vector of attack, simply because they are designed to be opaque. So unlike our traditional banking finance rails, which are designed to have a certain level of transparency and accountability, cryptocurrency is a form of money that has been designed with the primacy of privacy. So a lot of crypto advocates, you will hear them say that crypto is actually more transparent and more traceable than traditional forms of finance because everything is logged on the blockchain. That's a very much in theory argument. In practice, there are lots of ways to obfuscate the chain of beneficial ownership using cryptocurrencies. And it is also very challenging for law enforcement agencies to trace various transactions back to the real life person. And the number one rule in political finance is we need to know where the money is coming from, who sits behind the check or the bank transfer, or in this case, the crypto wallet. We need to know, are they a foreign actor, or what is their motivation for donating? And that's really challenging to do with cryptocurrencies. And you can see that foreign actors view cryptocurrencies as a great leap forward in money laundering technology. And that is exactly why the FCA right now is in the process of creating financial services regulatory regime for crypto assets. And that is meant to launch in October 2027. And so I think one of the reasons why we at CFS at RUSI are calling for a moratorium, which is a temporary ban that can stay in place as long as possible, rather than an outright ban, is a lot of the times the security risks from crypto donations are less about direct donations from cryptocurrency wallets and more about where the laundering has occurred upstream. So the first 99 miles of a donation's life, if you will, as opposed to the last 1 mile. And right now in the bill, we do not see capabilities or safeguards designed to look further upstream into the life cycle of a donation to try and work out where it has been off-ramped. And that's frankly where hostile actors love to act. They love to act in that gray zone. And at the moment, it's actually quite easy to create a kind of Trojan horse for a permissible donor. Also, I think why we like the idea of a moratorium is, unfortunately, politicians generally tend to have a rather short attention span. And when you put a ban in place, everyone seems to pat themselves on the back and go home and go to sleep and think it's been dealt with. But the problem is the technology continues to develop. And the security risks, as I just said, are not really addressed. There are still vectors and vulnerabilities here that we need to think about. So when you have a moratorium, which is through the legislation requiring an order via the Secretary of State, consultation with the Electoral Commission and the various law enforcement agencies, you continue to create that impetus, that pressure that we need to look at these safeguards. We need to work with the relevant regulators, the electoral law regulators, the financial crime regulators, to start to think about how we can deal with this. Because frankly, if we are moving towards a UK crypto industry that is going to be regulated by the FCA, the pressure to increase donation channels through cryptocurrency will only increase. And so rather than simply banning it and kicking that can down the road, we should be using this opportunity to consult, to think about how we can best regulate this channel. And it may be incredibly narrow. It may be that we only allow donations via very, very strict pathways. But I think we need to accept the fact that digital assets and digital currencies are here to stay. And rather than simply wishing it's all going to go away, we need to actually start working with the regulators who are already thinking about this to create safe channels and controls.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Rachel, do you want to pick up on some of that? What's your view on cryptocurrencies and whether they should be allowed as donations? And more generally, are there things that you think or worry are loopholes in the bill?
So yes, I think we need to look very closely at cryptocurrency for precisely the reasons that Eliza set out. I think the tightening up of Know Your Donor is a way to talk about cryptocurrency, again, because whilst in theory you can track ownership of crypto, as Eliza explained, that is definitely a place that donors can hide, or people who want to hide can hide. An area that I particularly wanted to talk about was an area that I became familiar with when I was a candidate, because I was a candidate for 2 years, thereabouts, nearly 2 years. And when I was doing a bit more research in advance of speaking to you today, I thought that I had discovered a relatively new concept, but actually it's been known for over 20 years, which is about the regulated period. And I was reading about how the perma-campaigning, I thought perma-campaigning was a relatively new thing. It is not. And so just to really spell out the challenge, outside a regulated period, the rules for receiving donations are very different to inside the regulated period, and they are less they're less onerous, you could say. Onerous isn't quite the right word, but they're less thorough. And what that means is that anybody can be publicly a candidate. You don't have to have an agent. You can just be a candidate, as I was, and raise money from any possible source, and you only have to meet certain rules, which is to check eligibility. You don't then have to declare it. And when I was first a candidate, I just couldn't believe it. And so we looked through she wasn't formally my agent, but she was at the time. We looked through all of the legislation and guidance and confirmed that you really didn't need to. Not only did you not need to, you couldn't actually make declarations without putting yourself at risk of breaching GDPR guidance, because you're making declarations about individuals who may or may not want their data to be shared in that way, which creates another layer of complexity. So I'm sure many of you are aware, but in terms of the political party spending limits, the spending is regulated for a year, 365 days before polling day. That creates a bit of a challenge because you have to follow rules that you may not have to then declare because you may not be elected. So a number of us, but if you think you might be elected, you have to make sure that you are acting as if you have to make declarations if you are elected. So that's just a complexity that I think doesn't so much lack transparency because it's transparent what the rules are, but it's a complexity that could let you fall through the net. In terms of candidate spending limits and third-party campaigner limits, there are some distinctions between how candidates and political parties can spend differently. In terms of the length of time that we have been talking about reforming the elected spending periods, the Electoral Commission raised this in 2004, Hayden Phillips raised it in 2007, and then the Committee on Standards in Public Life raised it in 2011. And so that's part of the bill that I would really like to see more thought in terms of how we regulate outside the period.
Thank you. Yes, I've been writing about politics since 1996, and I think this issue has been live and really at the top of the agenda almost since then, but nobody has actually grasped the nettle. I wanted to ask, there's a question from Dennis McShane, who's actually had to go. I notice he's dropped off the call, but he says, should we just introduce state funding for political parties? Again, this is an old chestnut, and the question is that if the voters are that cross with politicians, would they actually be willing to pay more for the politics, even if in the end it cleaned it up? Duncan, what's your view on this?
Well, we're not calling for more state funding of political parties, but there's plenty happening already, right? And ironically, everyone voting on this bill is state funded, right? They draw a salary. They have an office of staff that are all state funded as well, right? So, I mean, let's not kid ourselves that we don't have state funding of politics. What we don't have is state funding of the pieces of paper that end up through your letterbox most of the time.
The adverts in your inbox or on your screens.
Yes, though we probably more often than people care to admit pay the salaries of the people that are designing some of that messaging, at least. And we have short money as well for the opposition political parties in the House of Commons. But given the charges that have been laid against the former chief executive of the Scottish National Party, and the funds which are alleged to have been embezzled from the SNP in recent years, you can understand why the public would be very hesitant about channeling the money that they pay in taxes into political parties' bank accounts to pay for campaigning. That's why, rather than the total ban that Dennis is advocating for, we are advocating for a cap. And we think that if political parties had a broader base of funders, that would not just be democratically healthy, it would also insulate against the corruption risks of politicians feeling beholden to particularly generous backers.
Kamila, I just wanted to come back to you briefly on the cryptocurrency point. Do you agree with Eliza about a moratorium, or some people say there should just be a complete ban? What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. In some ways it's not binary of moratorium or ban. It's more of a sliding scale of when you want to lift this ban/moratorium, because in a sense all bans in primary legislation are moratoriums because the next government can just lift them. So basically what we would stand for is what we would call a ban, which is something in primary legislation that says cryptocurrencies will not be considered a permissible donation, because of the fact that at the moment, when you ban cryptocurrency, you're not really disenfranchising anyone, really. Only 8% of the country holds cryptocurrency, and 68% of those earn over 100,000. So you're only really disenfranchising a tiny proportion of the population who have no reason to donate in cryptocurrency. There is no reason why someone needs to donate in crypto over normal fiat, as you'd call it. And of course, cryptocurrency is volatile, changes every day, so it's very difficult to know the value of the donation. So there are lots of reasons to institute a ban/moratorium. As I say, we would call it a ban. We think, at some point in the future, if the Electoral Commission has the powers and the resources it needs to regulate cryptocurrency really properly. And if cryptocurrency becomes a much more widely held currency, and it's not just 8% of the population that has crypto, but if it's like 50% or whatever, then there might be a case for lifting it. But at the moment, we don't see any reason to allow crypto donations given they're so dangerous, and we would call that a ban rather than a moratorium.
And you can always transfer it into a normal bank account, I assume, if you have cryptocurrency. So, it's not as if you're being banned from giving. Rachel, there's a question here from Francis Crook, which is, why not just prohibit all corporate donations? What do you think about that? Do you think actually the whole thing has become so muddy and off-putting to the voters that we should just ban all corporate donations altogether?
No, I don't think we should ban them altogether. And I'm a Labour politician. I think we have to think really carefully about how trade unions contribute to politics. I was really struck by where Duncan's very remarks that I agree with about a candor about how much public money is already going into politics. I don't think people, as Duncan suggests, acknowledge how much money is already going in. The other category that you left out is politicians making donations to campaigns or saving their own money to spend on campaigns. And that's MPs do that. I do that. Councillors do that. You make contributions into local group funds. There are then in local authorities, there are group organisers and group staff, and I think a candour about that would be helpful, and a public awareness about that would help. I think that then reveals the underlying problem that I know you talked about just before I joined the call, but about trust in politics more generally. And the fact that there is this real hesitation to adopt Dennis's suggestion about public funding of politics because of the fundamental trust issue. I'm too practical a person to say that we can only move forward on how we fund politics once we fix the overall trust problem, because I think the two are very much intertwined. But we can't lose sight of the fact that a greater understanding about the amount of public money already in politics, I think, would help more generally. Just on the crypto moratorium point, we have got a review ongoing at the moment about how we could bring that forward, and I think that the overarching, the salience of this topic is really critical at the moment.
And so, how would you deal with the trade unions issue? Would you, if there was some kind of cap, would you apply it?
I haven't got a ready solution for that.
Okay, Duncan, would you apply your cap to trade union donations?
So to discretionary donations, but not to affiliation fees. So Hayden Phillips looked at this, and the conclusion which we accept and support is that is essentially bundling small donations from permissible donors, from ordinary working people, and that doesn't in and of itself represent an issue in terms of corruption risk or in terms of distorting the democratic process, and it is actually a participatory mechanism. What he did say for that position to hold is that affiliation fees would need to be at a consistent level per person per year, regardless of which union they were coming from. And I know that that's slightly countercultural in terms of collective bargaining by trade unions, but you appreciate the point. If it is just bundling an affiliation fee, then it needs to be a fixed fee, rather than something which is up for negotiation. And so that being the case, what we're really talking about here is individuals who might carry a lot of sway because of the discretion they have over whether a political party receives the money in their control or not.
Okay. Eliza, could I broaden it a tiny bit and just say, I was really interested by what you were saying about foreign interference in politics. And actually, that isn't only or even perhaps primarily through donations. And I wonder whether the bill here is missing an opportunity to deal with those wider manipulation, for example, through deepfake social media posts or which we've seen in other countries, certainly, and possibly in this country. What's your view on that?
I think it touches to something that Rachel talked about, which is the fact that we still apply this antiquated notion that there are electoral periods that require a certain level of regulation, and then there are non-electoral periods that require a lower level of regulation. That might have been the case when these types of frameworks were first put in place, when an election was called, the Murdochs of their day got out their checkbooks. You could look at the newspaper article and there'd be a little line at the bottom saying who this was paid for, and then the election was over and everyone went home. Now what we see is that the attempt to direct political discourse in certain directions occurs 365 days a year, regardless of whether an election is on foot or not. And frankly, it's much cheaper and easier for me to create a so-called grassroots movement that causes division and riots in the center of London and skews the political focus in various directions and divides the electorate than it is for me to buy a politician. So I think we need to start having a conversation about what political interference actually looks like in this century, and the fact that we are incredibly porous to the types of playbooks that we are seeing play out in Romania, in Moldova, in terms of how their elections are being directed. And frankly, a lot of that funding is coming through crypto because it is the easiest way to channel that money in. And I completely agree with Kamila that every ban is in its sense a moratorium. But I think why I like the idea of a moratorium is that it keeps the issue on the agenda. If there is a moratorium with the ability for it to be lifted, we need to talk about, are we regulating crypto not just in electoral periods, but across the board? Are we regulating advertising and how that's being paid for, and messaging on social media and how that's being paid for? Because most of that's coming through crypto. It gives us a window to be more flexible with what we are asking of our politicians and to keep the pressure on to have this conversation. And the other side of the coin is, who is enforcing this? What is the law enforcement agency that has the necessary capabilities, technology, and statutory powers to deal with this? Because right now there isn't one. And we need to start having that conversation now before we keep going down this road, because we should have a crack squad. I mean, I'm biased. I'm talking for someone who used to work for an electoral commission, right? But they should be a crack squad with all the tools and the funding and the capabilities and the statutory powers at their command to deal with this in an independent way. And I note that it's a great move forward that we have repealed the strategy from the Electoral Commission. So they now are going to get their independence back, which is something I welcome. But we need to go further. We need to start talking about who is actually going to be enforcing these laws, and do they have the tools at their command to do so?
Kamila, do you think the Electoral Commission needs more teeth?
Yes, absolutely. Spotlight on Corruption is actually just about to publish a report on electoral finance enforcement. So this is perfect timing. Yeah, absolutely. The Electoral Commission needs more teeth. At the moment, the Electoral Commission can only fine up to £20,000. The Representation of the People Bill says, and it's a bit complex, it will be through, I think, statutory instrument rather than in primary legislation, but it will result in the fine being increased to £500,000. But even £500,000 would amount to just 1.7% of Labour Party spending in the last election and 2% of Conservative spending in the last election. So that is still a tiny amount. You could say that's just the cost of doing business for political parties. So we would argue that the fine needs to be either 500,000 or 4% of campaign spending, whichever is higher. So that's just one way in which it can be strengthened. Another way in which it can be strengthened is for the Electoral Commission to be able to, when it investigates civil offences, to be able to investigate it to a civil standard of proof, the balance of probabilities. Whereas at the moment, it has to prove it to a criminal standard of proof, even though it's actually a civil investigation, which doesn't really make any sense. We could strengthen it also by just actually providing more funding. If you look at the funding to the Electoral Commission, it's something like £1 per voter compared to £6 per voter in Australia. So the Electoral Commission just doesn't have enough resources behind it. It needs to have more information sharing powers, and also, but criminal, as Eliza said, criminal enforcement needs to be a lot stronger. We need a specialist police unit. I mentioned earlier that there haven't been any imprisonments for political finance offences. The largest fine, by the way, ever for a political finance offence was just £6,000. So there are a huge variety of things we need to do to improve enforcement, because there's no point having rules unless you actually enforce them.
Mm-hmm. There's an
Can
interesting
I
comment
come in on that,
Oh,
Rachel?
yes, Rachel.
I don't know if I'm the only politician in the room, but I think that I was going to make Camilla's point about the criminal investigation side and the capacity within the police, and actually the probably local police officers as well, because some of these crimes, offences take place in local elections, and which leads me to my second point, which is about education and enforcement for candidates in terms of both knowing when a crime has been committed against you and knowing and having the confidence and that that crime will be properly investigated and prosecuted, because I think that part of enforcement is probably underappreciated, but also knowing that you will be prosecuted if you commit an offence.
Thank you. There's an interesting comment here from Frances Crook again. She's talking about a Seattle experiment in funding parties, where when you vote, you also vote to allocate a certain amount of money to the party of your choice as a way of sort of spreading and democratizing donations. Duncan, do you think that's a good idea?
Well, unless you want to fund a different party to the one that you vote for, I mean, that's essentially public funding based on a share of support formula. And we've talked about the issues with advocating for more public funding in the current context. But it's really helpful for Francis to have reminded us that, yeah, other democracies are grappling with this issue, some with more success than others. You know, in Australia, they managed to have cross-party support before the last general election for a cap on donations, which comes into effect this July. And they had some very similar phenomena to those that we've got in this country, right? They had a mining magnate who single-handedly was bankrolling a political party, another very wealthy person who was, ensuring that a new entrant political party was causing some of the older parties to feel the heat. But the money was changing the shape of Australian politics. In Canada, they have a cap on donations too. And then, forgive me for mentioning the United States in their current parlous state, but, we did witness Elon Musk making millionaires out of voters for engaging in political campaigns in the run-up to the last presidential campaign. And there was uproar at the time, which only served to give it more publicity, that he was probably breaking a rule. And I expect he probably was. But he ended up at the president's right hand, not facing any accountability for breaching election conduct rules. And so I am particularly concerned that we put in place arrangements which normalize protections against money buying influence in our politics, rather than entirely relying on the idea that you go after the offenders after the event. Because when it comes to democracy, the price has already been paid if a politician has been bought before polling day, and they may be in a position to ensure that no one does anything about it afterwards.
There's a question here from Ewan Grant. Eliza, maybe you could take this one. How do you address revolving door corruption, not financial directly, but job offers in return for support?
Again, coming to this country, I was astounded that MPs could actually have other jobs while they are still currently serving, let alone sort of jobs afterwards. But there are methods we have in place. They're clearly not working. We need to have a more scrutiny on the kind of lobbying aspect and the perks that are picked up after someone leaves public office, and you can put cooling off periods and various things in place. But yes, more importantly, we need to be looking at what politicians are doing whilst they are in office, when they are supposed to be serving their constituents, what jobs, what columns are they writing for, not naming names, but what else are they doing whilst supposedly serving their community? That is essentially a backdoor for undue influence and foreign interference.
This is a question
There's
from
more
Joe
to do.
Wright. Oh, sorry, Rachel, come in.
I think there's more to do on declarations about members of Parliament's interest that, again, I discovered in terms of my own declaration of interest because of my spouse's work was for a campaigner for a third sector organisation that I'm very happy for people to know about, obviously, but because he was in-house, there was no need to declare it. But if he had been part of an agency, so he could have been in-house at any old organisation that you would probably really want to know, as it is he's a social security campaigner, which you may not be surprised to hear, and I don't have any concerns about being transparent about that, but he could be working for any kind of corporate, and if he was in-house, it doesn't need to be declared, which I just don't understand. There's also, I really want to emphasise the point about transparency on third-party money and what third party is. Again, it's a point about third-party organisations that are not necessarily the Labour, the Liberal Democrat, the Tories, the Green parties. What they are doing very much under the guise of being independent when really they're not, and both a education piece and a transparency piece is really essential on those issues.
Duncan, do you want to come in on that point?
I think we're short of time. I'm happy to pass.
Okay. This is from Joe Wright, who's from the Tax Justice Group. Are concerns around political donations a bit 20th century when the wealthiest can buy media and social media to drive political support? And I wonder whether people could also address my question about the sort of deep fakes, that the extent to which information is being manipulated, not always for money, actually, but whether to disrupt or to manipulate and change people's opinions. Kamila, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think others probably will want to come in and know more than me, but yeah, this is absolutely an issue. You can donate 100 million to a political party, or you can donate 100 million to an influencer, or you can spread it out across influencers. And as Rachel pointed out, there is no spending limit at the moment between elections. So if I was a political party and received 100 million, I would just spend it 2 or 3 years before an election, essentially win the election in advance, and then just coast through the 12 months before the election. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you are Elon Musk, as well as making £100 million donation, you could just adjust the algorithm of Twitter/X so that Reform's post or Restore Britain's post or Advance UK's posts come up first. And that's the equivalent of making a massive donation, but you don't have to declare it. Or you could donate to GB News. So there is absolutely a serious issue. At the same time, donation caps are still important. I will just fly the flag for TI. If you can donate, I mean, Christopher Hobon, I think so far has donated 25 million to Reform in total. So donations are still a massive issue, and donation caps are necessary. If not sufficient, they are still absolutely necessary. And deepfakes, yeah, of course, it's going to be an increasing issue. I think the government does need to focus on educating young people about how to recognise deepfakes. But as they become more and more sophisticated, it will become harder and harder to recognise them.
Eliza, what's your view on the social media landscape?
I think we're seeing different jurisdictions take different approaches. So we're starting to see the European Union, its AI and Digital Services Act come into force, the UK through its Online Safety Act. Once again, we're always going to be playing catch up with the technology. So there is an element to us continuing to be as agile as we possibly can. But I think, as sort of Kamila touched on, there's an element of following the money here. And I mean, I say this from a centre that that specialises in following the money, but I find it much easier to try and follow the money than to try and keep up to date with the various tech. So if you can shut down who is actually funding various online activities for certain purposes before we even get to a conversation around sort of free speech, if you can look at it from a foreign interference perspective, that's much more effective from an enforcement sort of thing than trying to wade into the very murky waters around what constitutes free speech in this space, what constitutes political discourse. If there is evidence that this is being funded by foreign or illicit donors, then you can just blow it out of the water at that threshold.
Okay, Duncan, do you think there's something old-fashioned about this sort of focus on political donations, and actually political influence comes in so many shapes and forms now?
I think it is fair to say the problem is much wider, but that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be tackling, if you like, the most simplest element that's closest at hand. And from an anti-corruption point of view, it is more of a concern when there is this direct relationship between a future public office holder and someone's money, than the more arm's length often arrangement where you have people spending their money on election independently of the politicians. But it's worth noting that, Lord Lebedev of Siberia, his gift to Boris Johnson wasn't cash, right? It was non-cash. It was the sort of thing you're asking about prior to his ennoblement. Unlike other members of the House of Lords who were having to stump up at least £3 million before they managed to get to the upper house. So it is a wider issue, but I am sometimes a little bit frustrated in our political discourse that we reach for the shiny thing, the glittery thing, the thing that's new, that's scary, that's interesting for people to talk about, instead of just getting on with a more straightforward thing that is definitely still a problem that hasn't been fixed.
Mm. Rachel, this is probably one for you. Ben Rich asked, do we think that the government has any appetite at all for any sort of donation cap? If not 50,000, as Duncan suggests, £1 million, £500,000, what level is politically deliverable? Or do you think the government's just too scared of its wealthy donors?
I don't think it's the latter, and I don't know the answer, but I think that having a practical conversation of getting into whether or not it is scale or is it a principle or is it a scale is the right question to ask. I wanted to make a detail point about we're not just talking about spending out of the regulated period. We need to acknowledge that it's about declarations as well. And at the moment, you can raise an awful lot of money without declaring it. And when you spending and declaration are a different thing. But just in terms of the cap point, I think the real challenge is acknowledging that the other theme of this discussion, which is, are we regulating every sector and channel that is currently having an important role in our democracy? And yes, let's talk about caps and let's think about caps and levels and who's making the donations, but we have to be really smart about making sure it's all of our regulations reach each of the different channels.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to end by asking each of you for a very quick answer on what do you think is the one thing that would most restore trust in politics, which, sort of returning to the beginning, I think is the actual most important underlying issue here. What if there were one measure, what would it be? I'm going to start with Kamila.
Well, until Monday, was it Monday? I'd have said restoring the independence of the Electoral Commission, but we have won that argument, so I don't need to say that anymore. Yeah. What is the one thing that would restore trust in politics? I'm going to let Duncan say donation caps. So I will say reducing the spending limit so that parties don't have to rely on big donors in the way that they do now.
Eliza, what would you say?
Yeah, I'm going to try and pick something different because I think we could all agree on same things, but I'm going to pick the enforcement angle. If there are no consequences for your actions, then what are we doing? We need to have a law enforcement body that is equipped to deal with the complexities of foreign interference and political finance offences and come down hard on offenders.
Duncan?
Well, I'm going to try and say donation caps in a different way. And I think what it comes down to is the public need to have confidence that everyone that holds power over them is doing so in working for them and not for anyone else. Mm-hmm. And that's the fundamental thing that I think would justify public trust in politics, and which, frankly, too often is brought into question.
Rachel, what's your view?
With the bill, I would support the enforcement point. I think there's too many parts of electoral law that we're not having clarity over, and that people don't know they can take action over and delivering on the what are the rules. But a broader point is actually changing the overall political dialogue, and the overall political discourse, much more conversations between representatives and the people that they represent, so that people understand why things happen and why things don't happen. But I appreciate that's not within the gift of this bill. That's within the gift of politicians like myself changing how they behave.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to all of you. I'm going to throw back to Ben now for a summary and roundup.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for a really interesting discussion. Thanks particularly to Rachel Sylvester for chairing and keeping us moving very smoothly and addressing all of the points. Rachel Blake for joining us, charging out of the chamber, and thank you for finding us. To Kamila, Eliza and Duncan, really interesting set of comments. And also I want to just add one other name, who's Annie Johnson, who's our lead on Brazilian democracy and who's led this discussion. There's clearly some way to go with this bill, and this is a topic I think we want to return to look at other aspects of the bill. It's very clear that there is the opportunity that the government's listening in this area, and the commitment to restore the independence of the Electoral Commission suggests that if we chip away, and I suspect there's broad agreement from the people on the call that we need to make progress, that there is space on political caps on some of the issues around crypto and some of the others that we've addressed to move the government in the right direction. So I hope that people will keep campaigning if that's what they're involved in, make certain that the government knows their thinking. Just a couple of other things. Obviously, we're very nervous about donations to political parties. I am very much in favour of donations to Radix Big Tent. If you've enjoyed the session, please feel free to log on our site and give us a $5 or a $10 to help us organise more of these. When I talk about organising more of these, our next session is a much easier topic that we're going to be addressing. We have Don McIntyre, who was for many years the independent Jerusalem bureau chief, talking about, initially when we first planned it, just Israel and Gaza, and we rather felt a need to widen out his brief. So Israel, Gaza, Iran, and the whole of the Middle East, whatever next, what is happening. I really hope people will join us for that. I think it should be an absolutely fascinating discussion. 16th of March, you can register on our website or in the chat. One more, thank you so much to all of our speakers. Great session, and see you all again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye. Bye.